Welcome to PCADV's Ask an Advocate. Today we are going to be talking about family violence in the context of domestic violence. We have Jessa Winas here today to lead us in this discussion. Recently we've put out some information about what's happening with Britney Spears and the abuse that she's been subjected to at the hands of her family. And so Jessa and I thought that this would be the perfect time to talk with you all about family violence, because it's often not thought of when we think about domestic violence. We most commonly think of intimate partner violence, but family violence is also a big part of domestic abuse. So I'm gonna turn it over to Jessa to take it away and get us started.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Lauren said, I'm going to be talking about family violence across the lifespan and referring a lot to the Britney Spears article that we wrote to kind of describe some of the tactics. So before we start, it's important to some of the things we may be talking about today, maybe a lot to hear or something you've experienced. So please take care of your needs throughout this. So let's start. So what is domestic violence? What it is, it's a pattern of coercive behavior used by one person to gain and maintain power and control over another in an intimate or familial relationship. So that key piece in our definition of domestic violence in Pennsylvania is that familial piece, right? It can also be extended to family. So many terms are used interchangeably to describe and discuss domestic violence. Sometimes you may hear to it referred to as something like just abuse, domestic violence, battery, intimate partner violence, family, spousal relationship, or dating violence. In the context that we're going to be using today, we're going to be using domestic violence and we're meaning familial violence. So domestic violence is the willful intimidation that's used as a part of systemic pattern of power and control. Just some statistics about domestic violence: 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in the United States have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. On a typical day, domestic violence hotlines receive approximately 21,000 calls, an average of close to 15 calls every minute. So putting that into the context of the time that we're spending together today, roughly like 45 minutes to an hour, thinking of that 15 calls per minute. And on average, a person in an abusive relationship will make 8 to 10 attempts to leave, with a 90% fatality risk that exists within the first 6 months after leaving. So those are some kind of stats around domestic violence. So I'm going to talk about what the tactics that are used look like. So for some folks, this may look familiar. This is called the power and control wheel. We have a wheel for everything. We love wheels in our field. We're going to really dive into what these tactics are, but just to explain how this operates. This was the power and control wheel was adapted and developed by the Duluth model. And what it does is this outer rim, the darker purple with a light green text, it defines violence or the threat of violence that's presenting in the family in this relationship. Each spoke of the wheel, which are the light green with the teal text, represent different tactics that abusers may use to achieve the goal, which is in that center, which is power and control. So physical and sexual assaults or threats to commit them are the most apparent forms of domestic violence and are usually the actions that allow others to become aware of the problem. However, regular use of other abusive behaviors by the abuser, when reinforced by one or more acts of violence, makes up this larger system of abuse that you see on your screen. The power and control diagram is a particularly helpful tool in understanding the overall pattern of abusive and violent behaviors, which are used by an abuser, again, to establish and maintain power and control over the other person. Very often, one or more violent incidents are accompanied by an array of these other types of tactics of abuse. There is a wheel for most identities. This is the traditional power and control wheel, the OG, if you will. This kind of encompasses DV 101. Depending on identities you hold, specifically if they're marginalized identities, there are tactics that abusers can manipulate to gain and maintain that power and control. They operate in tandem with not siloed from the one you see on your screen. So for instance, if somebody's experiencing domestic violence, we have this wheel of what the tactics look like. But then if you are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, there's a set of tactics related to that identity that can also be occurring on top of these. So they kind of layer on. There's also ones around children, so age. Again, there's a wheel for any identity that an abuser can manipulate to establish power and control related to that identity. So some of the ways that the methods of control can happen are physical abuse. That is usually the intentional and unwanted physical contact, emotional abuse, which is controlling another person's actions and behaviors through verbal and emotional manipulation, sexual abuse, which is any type of unwanted sexual behavior or contact, financial abuse, which is control of one's ability to acquire, use, and maintain money. And then technological abuse, which is the use of things like technology, texting, social media, to bully, harass, stalk, or intimidate somebody. So again, these are kind of the methods of how these dynamics can come out. And I did want to just share this blog. We're going to drop it into the chat for folks that haven't had a chance to see this. I know the conversation around Britney Spears is everywhere, and it's really important that we put her experience into context, and what that is domestic violence. Britney Spears is experiencing family violence, and we're going to talk through, again, the wheel, and I'm going to walk you through what this can present as in family violence, and then pull out a Britney story, how this is coming to fruition. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So the first tactic, the first kind of piece of the wheel is privilege. And what this looks like is where an abuser's identity is grounded in superiority. So this is where they speak for or over the survivor or on their behalf. They can make all major decisions without the survivor's consent, and they take advantage of their identity politics. So that's their more powerful stance in the community, whether that be racial, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their gender expression, their economic or class status, to, again, establish and maintain power and control. So typically in our society, white cis het men are set to benefit the most from society. And the idea that they're entitled to the power they get to get there is translated then into relationships. And by relationships, I mean the family relationship. That family dynamic can be impacted by this idea of privilege, and that comes along with gender roles and all of these other things that an abuser, again, can manipulate and control that narrative. So in the case of Britney Spears, her father, Jamie, obviously used his role as her father, right, to be that concerned parent of, this is my child. She's not able to take care of herself. I can make all these decisions, right? I'm a white cis het man. I'm like systemically able to do all of these things. And he utilized that, right? He had a lot of financial privilege, socioeconomic status that he was able to use to gain power and build relationships that helped him through the court process, through these relationships that he built to surround Britney with people he chose, right? Which is literally controlling her environment for power and control. Another tactic is economic abuse. And when we talk about economic abuse, it's a form of abuse when the abuser has control over the other person's access to economic resources, which diminishes the survivor's capacity to support themselves and forces them to depend on the abuser financially. It can show up in three ways, and those three ways are through exploitation, control, and sabotage. When we're talking about economic exploitation, abusers may, pay bills late or not pay bills that were in the survivor's name or in both names, right? So when we're talking about a house, maybe the family household, where the abuser is the main name on the lease or on the mortgage, and they're not making those payments, it impacts the entire family unit. They can spend or threaten to spend any money needed for rent or other bills that the survivor receives, either through unemployment, through stimulus money, or sick time or vacation time. They can build up debt under the survivor's name by doing things like opening credit cards without their consent, or running up the phone bill, or ordering a whole bunch of on-demand stuff to further prevent the survivor from being able to leave, right? This is in your name. You have to pay this astronomical bill. They can also threaten survivors that they'll call, DHS because they can't provide for their children. When we talk about economic control, abusers may demand to know how money was spent, right? Showing receipts, monitoring accounts, denying access to accounts so that survivor has no idea what's going on in the bank account. They can also make important financial decisions without talking with the survivor first, but demanding the survivor ask for permission before spending any money. They can keep financial and bank statements from the survivor, where the survivor doesn't know when unemployment or stimulus money may hit their account, or when payday happens, not have access to their funds. They can make the survivor ask for money for basic needs, including gas money. They can demand that you give the abuser, again, receipts or change whenever money is spent, and literally take account every single penny that the survivor is spending and demand that payment back. And all of these things can lead to economic sabotage, which is where abusers can do things like keeping a survivor from going to their job because of fear of COVID-19, or forcing them to go to their job, forcing them to go to work. They can threaten to inform the survivor's place of employment that they may, in times like these, that they are COVID positive, even if that's not true, or call the survivor's workplace and tell them, they're crazy, or they're on using substances or something to get them in trouble at work. They can also demand that the survivor quit their job. They can also force the survivor to take another job in order to support the family financially, and then deny access to that money. They can also force the survivor to obtain loans or sign financial documents without any understanding and denying them the education around what that looks like. Or they may refinance a home, like refinance a mortgage or a car loan without the survivor's knowledge, which again can impact a credit score long-term. So really what it boils down to is that the abuser underlies the survivor's ability to be self-sufficient economically. And economic abuse is one of the most common forms of domestic violence. It occurs in 99% of domestic violence relationships. So it's a really common tactic that's used in some way. So obviously Britney Spears is in a conservatorship. Her dad has no access to money. Her father controls all of it. She's told how to spend it, when to spend it. She's also forced to work. She did not want to do her Las Vegas tour. He made her do it. He even medicated her to comply to that request for him to benefit economically for her performing. So again, this is where some of these connections you can start to hear make these connections with Britney Spears' experience.
Just before, real quick, we move on to the next spoke on the wheel, I just wanted to draw some attention to the fact that economic abuse, and for any of these really, but economic abuse is one that I think some people may think of in situations where there's already like economic hardship within that like family situation. And I just wanted to point out that I think Britney Spears is a example that really highlights the fact that this can happen to anyone, no matter what your financial situation starts out as. I mean, Britney Spears brings in, millions of dollars and earns a lot of money on these tours that she does. And even she was forced into this situation where she doesn't have control over her own economics and her own financial future and her independence. So I think that that's important for us to think about when we're thinking about this case in relationship to Britney Spears, is that this really can happen to anybody.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's really important that we really break down kind of the stigma that exists around being a survivor and what that actually looks like. Because domestic violence can occur regardless of any identity you have, regardless of economic status, identities, what types of relationships you're in. It expands to family, right? It happens across anyone can be a survivor, but also abusers can also be anyone. So it's really important to kind of work beyond kind of what the media portrays this to look like, because there is no perfect victim. There is no perfect survivor. There is no perfect case of DV. It's extremely unique, just as unique as all of the relationships that we have in our lives are, right? Everyone has unique relationships with their family, members of their family, and then intimate relationships as well. So thank you, Lauren. Cool. So when we're talking about coercion and threats, we're by definition, coercion is the use of force or manipulation to control an intimate partner's thoughts, actions, and behaviors through violence, intimidation, threats, degradation, isolation, or surveillance. So in the context of domestic violence, coercion can involve things like financial coercion, psychological, physical, sexual, reproductive, and other kinds of abuse to undermine and control a survivor. So other words similar to coercion that you might be more familiar with are things like intimidation, pressure, influence, harassment, oppression, enforcement, or even arm twisting. The way that this can show up are things like threats to leave. If you don't, then I'm going to leave, and who's going to take care of you? You can't take care of the household by yourself. Who's going to help you raise the kids? Who's going to pay the bills, right? Especially if we pair that with economic abuse, because these tactics rarely occur isolated. They're a network that all kind of coincide together. They can also utilize threats of homicide or suicide. Reproductive coercion, which we are seeing in Britney Spears. She has an IUD that she is forced to keep in, that she did not give consent to get, and does not have permission to get out by somebody that's external to her own body. She does want to have a family, to expand her family, but she is not allowed to do that. Substance use coercion and mental health coercion, both of these are also prominent. When we're talking about mental health coercion, we're talking about the way that Britney Spears has essentially been gaslit to think that she is mentally incompetent or mentally incapable of handling her own affairs, which after hearing her statements is absolutely not true. But she has been forced to think that. So again, being gaslit, being overly medicated, which is where we see substance use coercion, where she's forced to be medicated on medications that she does not want to be on nor need to be on because of a perceived diagnosis that was advocated for by her abuser, by her father. And then there's also a lot of threats going on, right? Threats to never see her kids. She's been isolated from her children. So it's really important to recognize how coercion can show up because those things in themselves have a whole set of tactics that then abusers can, again, put into place on top of this experience of generalized coercion and threats. So when we're talking about intimidation, these are verbal and nonverbal tactics used to control another person that are used to instill fear or elude that the survivor may be next, right? So this could be, again, using looks, actions, or gestures to induce fear. They can block doorway exits so that you are trapped in a room, so there's no escape from the emotional abuse or the physical intimidation that's occurring. They can destroy property. Well, I never hit you, but in the meantime, they're throwing things, they're destroying things that are emotionally important to you. And then they can also display weapons. That's a really big intimidation tactic of, getting out and sitting a gun or starting to clean a gun while you're in an argument or while something is occurring. And they can also abuse pets. The way that this can show up through Britney Spears' experience is she said that she was afraid to speak out because she didn't know her options. So that intimidation of you can't go forward to the courts, you're incapable, like you're crazy, right? All of this, not only the way that her family is doing, but how that narrative was reinforced by the media. How important that is to recognize. But then intimidation, her dad gets the paparazzi to follow her around, right? She's Britney Spears. Everyone wants to know what she's doing and where she's at all the time. That's an intimidation tactic. She shared in her testimony that she's forced to go to therapy, I think 3 times a week. She requested to go down to 1 and in her household because she's not able to leave her house without this intimidation of people knowing her every move. And that person that's informed the most is her father, right? So that's an intimidation tactic that's used against her that the public plays into. So she's getting that one kind of on both ends because it's brought on by her father, by her abuser, but then upkept by the public concern for Britney Spears. So when we're talking about emotional abuse, this is a pretty big one. So when we talk about what that means, it's emotional or psychological abuse. And again, it's one tactic that they can use for a method of control. What this can lead to is a survivor falsely believing that their abuser may change, or this isn't really their person, this isn't who they really are, because what the abuser has done is make a survivor question their own self-worth and their own reality. So the way that this can show up are things like put downs and name calling, right? Even if they sound like they're joking, it's not. Humiliating them, making them feel guilty or blaming them for the abuse. well, if you wouldn't do this, then I wouldn't have to X, Y, or Z. They can also, over time, work on eroding self-esteem so that you only get that validation that you emotionally need from the abuser. So at the same time they're building you, pulling you down, they're also there as your safe person, which is a really complicated relationship when you bring in the idea that this is also my parent, my aunt, my cousin, right? Your family, your sisters, your siblings. And then of course, gaslighting, which is a really common term that folks may be familiar with. If not, this is long-term psychological it's a psychological impact that starts by emotional abuse of these short kind of tidbits of like, calling you dumb, or why don't you understand these things? It's so frustrating. You're so stupid. No one's going to believe you. And then you start to rely on that abuser because they define your reality. Maybe I am crazy, right? Maybe I am losing it. I normally don't act this way. It's me. This is my problem. It's absolutely not true. So gaslighting really is an altered reality that's controlled by an abuser, which, as we can see in the case of Britney Spears, is her whole reality, that she, isn't capable of caring for her kids, not capable of identifying her own like crew and support system. She isn't able to control her finances, isn't able to work without assistance. So all of these things she's been told for years that she's incapable of doing. And at some point you start to believe them. You start to believe that, like, okay, maybe I do need some help. But Britney Spears recognizes that she's being gaslit and that she is more than capable than what's happening to her. And that's why she is, again, asking for this to be revoked and then proving her case that she is absolutely competent and capable. And we see this a lot in the disabilities justice community. Because people do make large assumptions and do gaslight people into thinking that they have actual diagnoses when they don't.
Jessa, I wanted to ask a question about the relationship between Britney and her sister and her father, and the way that dynamic plays into things. And would that fall under the emotional abuse, or would that fall under multiple categories? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, really, in reality, it covers a couple because we don't know what has been said to Jamie Lynn, the sister. We don't know what Dad Spears has shared with her about Britney. So there could be, and probably is, gaslighting, emotional abuse, intimidation, right? Like, don't feed into this. That she's unwell, making these large assumptions about her, and then using guilt, right? So bringing in some of that emotional abuse of, I'm the one that's in charge, like, don't disobey me. I'm the one that knows best. And then kind of shares that responsibility with her a little bit to bring her in and make her feel involved, but at the same time utilizing isolation and using children, which we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, to force the siblings apart, right? Because what does that do? That creates higher isolation between the two. And again, now he has more power and control over both. Because if they came together, which, as we saw, Jamie released a statement, and Britney responded saying absolutely not. So if you haven't seen that, it is on her Instagram. She put out a public statement about it. But this is something that parents do. They'll drive wedges between the survivor and other members of their family, right, including siblings. But I will get more into that. Thank you. Okay, so isolation. When we talk about isolation, it's a behavior that aims to cut the survivor off from friends, family, or community. It can also involve attempts to harm their relationships or reputation. This can present as things like controlling who they see, who they talk to, what social media or news they have access to, defining what they do, again, without consent, limiting social activities and interactions, or forcing them to participate in places that they don't want to participate in. They can limit access to technology, and they can use jealousy to justify actions. They could use jealousy or manipulate love. So we can see a lot of love bombing, which is where somebody just really just makes you feel good, real good, right? Tells you everything you want to hear. And then there's a but to it, right? Like, oh, I love you so much. Here's some new stuff. I'm going to take you school shopping. I'm going to do these things for you, but I need you to not talk to her because clearly she's crazy, right? Or she's really harmful. I don't know why you'd want to engage with someone that's so problematic. All you do, she's so wild, why do you hang out with them? Your behavior changes around them. And then they start to kind of build boundaries, unhealthy and false boundaries around pushing people out of their lives, including other family members. Again, what this can also show up as is misleading family members about that person's well-being, or forcing family members to keep secrets from the survivor, or the survivor keeps secrets from other family members. We see this a lot with children. And then they can also, again, speak over the survivor or speak for them in social, medical, or financial situations. So again, when we see this in relation to the Britney Spears case, Britney has been cut off from her children and her mother, and Jamie Lynn, her sister. She was also removed. Her manager that she, worked with for the majority when her career was before 2013, all of her prominent career pieces, that manager is now gone. And her abuser, her dad, replaced her entire world with hand-selected people that would allow him to feed into this idea of, oh, she's crazy, she's losing her mind, she's not able to understand how to manage finances, right? He's misleading his family, right? So Jamie Lynn, creating that divide, including Britney's mom, about her well-being, also informing the media of this for them to latch on to. And then keeping, Jamie Lynn, you can't talk to her. All of the business dealings are between the dad and the sister and have nothing to do with Britney, right? So there's that lack of communication, that isolation piece that really comes into play. And again, we don't know for sure, but I'm assuming using love bombing, right? As your father, why wouldn't you support me? I want what's best for her. She's my kid too. That kind of stuff is what would show up. And as you can see, that's not just isolation, that plays into emotional abuse, intimidation, economic abuse. All of these things, again, are so interconnected. And it's really critical that we see that because, oftentimes we think IPV, we think of domestic violence, we think, oh, it's physical violence. If it's not physical, nothing's happening. And that is not true, especially in this case. There hasn't been, there's been accusations of physical harm with her kids, but there hasn't been physical violence between Britney and her dad. It's all of these other tactics. Not everything always results in physical violence, but all of these other tactics, as you can see, can really cause harm to a survivor, right? So it's really important that we separate this idea again of what we're told about what domestic violence looks like, of who the perpetrators are, who survivors are, and what it actually looks like. Because as you can see, they often don't operate alone and can exist without that physical element as well. So when we're talking about minimizing, denying, and blaming, this one's a pretty big one. So typically, abusers frequently try to avoid accountability for their actions by minimizing the abuse or turning it around on the survivor, right? Oh, it's not really that bad. I just want you to work. Or I could have hit you, but I didn't. Or I wouldn't have hit you if you would have just been quiet. Or, I only did that because, oh my God, you pushed my buttons, right? Or we don't do that in this house. And when you're in my house, this is how we act, right? They can, when we talk about denial, it entails acting as if they have not been abusive or controlling or not caused harm. So therefore, they believe there's nothing to be responsible or held accountable for. That again plays into gaslighting, right? You're making all this up. It's really not that bad, but it is. Minimizing entails acknowledging they may have done something harmful, but won't take that responsibility for the level of abusive behavior and the level of harm that they caused the survivor. And when we talk about blaming, it entails admitting that what they have done was abusive, that they use controlling behaviors, admitting that the survivor may feel harmed, but takes absolutely no ownership or responsibility for their actions or the effects, right? Again, that it wasn't that bad, just get over it, oh my God, we're still on this. Why are we still talking about this? That was a month ago, a week ago, years ago. When this comes in, what this looks like when it's rationalized and justified. So again, similar to minimizing, people who use power and control to get their way still use reasoning and rationalization. They'll rationalize by saying things like, I only did it one time, or I never actually hit you. What's the actual problem? Yet, in actual fact, they're using controlling tactics, right? The things that we've been talking about so far in an ongoing way over a long period of time. They rationalize that by saying that one behavior they did a moment ago was a one-off, and therefore minimize the incessant ongoing pattern of control across time. And when a controlling person justifies their behaviors, they usually turn the attention onto the survivor, saying that they wouldn't have behaved that way if the survivor hadn't X, Y, or Z. And what that means is if they would have just did what the abuser wants them to do, again, going back to that power and control, then I wouldn't have done this to you. So really, we see a lot of this going on where Brittany's dad is like, listen, I don't understand the problem. It's not that bad. She really doesn't understand like how to do these things. She really needs this help, right? And again, not only to Brittany, but people around her. So abusers often don't only go after and utilize the survivor in their tactics, it's their environments as well, because they're really savvy in painting a narrative of the survivor that they want the community to see and see them in a certain way. So that whenever you hear things like this person's an abuser, everyone's like, oh, they could never, they're such a nice person, right? Oh, I just, I hang out with them regularly. They could never do that. This person must be making it up, or it can't be that bad. Maybe they just misunderstood, right? And that's exactly what the abuser wants. They want to minimize, deny, blame, and manipulate the narrative that exists, not only with the survivor, but what's around them, because then people won't believe the survivor. And Brittany said that when she went to court, I didn't think anyone was going to believe me, right? After all of these years and all of these things that have been said against me, all of the coercion that she's experienced, she didn't know she had the option to ask for this because who's going to believe me, right? And that's so common with survivors, that they have been through all of these tactics for such a prolonged period of time. Again, who's even going to listen? So it's really important that we understand, again, how these all work together. And then the last kind of spoke on our wheel that we're going to go through is children, right? So this tactic is when abusers get what they want from the children or the other parent or another member of the family through children. So the love for their children can be superseded by the need to maintain power and control in this dynamic. So what this can look like is threatening to take children away, or actually taking them away, using visitation to harass, using children to relay messages, guilt regarding children, and using children as confidants. So children are often used as leverage, and this is common when one party wants to hurt the other. So again, threatening to take the kids, if you don't, then I'm going to call CYS and tell them X, Y, or Z about you. They can use their someone's immigration status, their mental health, actual or perceived, right? Or their substance use against the survivor and connecting that to their parenting. They can use a visitation process to harass the survivor. They can also intentionally disrupt a child's routine and sleeping patterns, their schooling, hygiene, and basic care. So, a kid comes back full of sugar or full of medication or has dirty diapers or haven't showered or changed their clothing, intentionally to undermine the survivor. They can also take advantage of custody based on communicated of what they're supposed to do, calling, texting, or showing up only related to custody to then harass and borderline into ways that turn into stalking behavior. They can also use children to relay messages. So telling the kids that they were going to take, mom's going to take me back to court to get out of paying for child support because she has that new job of hers, or she got fired from that new job of hers and can't keep a job. She's such a lazy person, a terrible person, all of that kind of messaging. And then the children get worried, right? And they tell the other parent. And now the other parent has to deal with that. But then that child is holding that guilt, navigating that really hard process of witnessing what's going on, but also having relationships, really complicated relationships with abusers and non-abusers. They can also use them as confidants, right? Telling them things, and then tell them, you can't tell because it's a big secret, right? We see this a lot with really inappropriate things, specifically around sexual behavior with kids, instilling messages about, money, supposed affairs, how, your parent tries to keep being away because they're saying, I'm crazy, I'm, brainwashing against the survivor, and a whole host of other topics that are inappropriate to speak to children about. They can also ask them to take sides or get involved in arguments or take on roles that aren't age appropriate for children to be involved in. In the case of Britney Spears, obviously she's not allowed to see her children, and she has supervised visitation with people who are actively abusing her. She's also not allowed to have new children, to build a new family. And again, as we mentioned before, her father pitted the children against each other. He used a child to further isolate and abuse another, right? So Jamie Lynn is cut off from Britney, has all these other messages. Britney is now completely isolated and alienated from them. So again, he was able to utilize his privilege, his position in the family, through who knows what tactics with Jamie Lynn to separate the two sisters from each other, to increase Britney's isolation, which ultimately pushes forward his power and control of her situation, which is essentially all built through economic abuse, right? Because all of it is for money. Yes. Are there any questions about the tactics in the wheel? I know that's a lot of information, but I thought it was really important to walk through them.
Yeah, Jessa, thank you so much for going through all of that. And I like that you have stressed for everyone the importance of the interconnectedness of these different tactics, and that it's usually not just one thing or another thing. It's usually a whole web of these tactics that are interrelated and play into each other, that go into this pattern of behavior that is abuse. So we did have a couple of questions. One of the questions is, can you get a PFA against a family member like you can against an intimate partner when there's abuse happening?
Yes, the way that the language in the Protection from Abuse Act, which outlines that process for survivors, our definition of domestic violence includes family. So you are able to get protection from abuse orders from family members when you are experiencing abuse.
Great. And kind of related to that, since this is something that somebody could do if they're looking to get a PFA against a family member, is can you access services from the local domestic violence programs if you're experiencing family violence as opposed to intimate partner violence?
Yep, all of our programs, we're a network of 59 programs throughout the Commonwealth. So we're in every single county. We offer an array of services, but we serve anybody who is a victim or survivor of domestic violence, which includes intimate partner violence as well as familial violence.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we're going to put the link in the chat for this to find your local program, just in case there's anybody who would like to get in touch with an advocate from their local program to talk about anything that they might be experiencing. Next question is related to if you are an advocate and mandated reporting with family abuse. It can happen with elder adults in the family. It can happen between adult children and an adult parent. So when you're working with older adults in the context of family abuse, are there differences in mandated reporting than there are when working with children?
Yes. So in the state of Pennsylvania, well, in our programs, right, we are not mandated reporters of elder abuse. Anyone that works for a domestic violence or sexual assault agency or is a volunteer at them is only mandated for child abuse. And there's an array of reasons behind that. But the majority of it is because the language doesn't match in what requires for older adults. So ours is completely voluntary, and we take a more trauma-informed approach. So we would share with the older adult, here's our concerns, here's the options, would you want to call with me, and walking them through that. We are not mandated, but we do have a really great relationship with our Department of Aging and Older Adult Protective Services and Adult Protective Services. And I will share that resource a little later. But in terms of what our programs are mandated to do, it's only for cases of child abuse.
Thanks, Jessa. And then I actually have a question kind of related to that. With using the example of Brittany, we've mostly been talking about examples of these tactics and what abuse looks like when it is a parent who is abusing an adult child of theirs. Could you give an example of something that you might see if it's the other way around, if say there's an adult child that is abusing their older parent?
Yes, so I have that built in here, so that is coming.
Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yes. No, that's great. I'm excited that you anticipated that, so that's exciting. So I'm gonna move forward and then I will get to that. Okay, so again, oftentimes we talk about familial violence, we talk a lot about children, which is not uncommon to do. The important thing when we talk about children in DV, again, they kind of have this complicated place in this, whether they experience or witness, right? As a tactic, they're used in the abuse or they are actually a survivor of the abuse. Oftentimes, whenever we think about this, we forget that the survivor is aware, right? We often think, oh, take care of the child, focus on the child, and then forget there's also a survivor involved in the situation. So it's really important that when we talk about children in DV, we think about it as a holistic approach to the survivor and child, the non-offending parent and the child as well, right? So children can be used as a method of power and control by an abuser. Not all children that are exposed to violence are affected equally or in the same ways. So children who've experienced domestic violence are, again, navigating these complicated relationships because they're processing the relationship to the non-offending caregiver with the abuser, and then also themselves and what their place is in this kind of dynamic in the family. And providing peaceful space for children to address these concerns individually and with their non-offending caregiver is really how advocates can begin facilitating healing, and that's the approach that we take in our programs. So when we talk about children and their experience with DV, we're talking about things like physical abuse, which are, pinching, hitting, twisting arms, pushing, shaking, strangulation. The orange, I don't want to call it a trick. There's a thing with oranges that are used in older adults and children because they have thinner skin and their organs are closer to the tops of their skin. If you throw an orange, just like a piece of fruit at full force at somebody, it can cause internal bleeding without leaving a physical bruise behind. So they can cause a lot of physical harm without any repercussion if they then go to the hospital. It gets written off as something else. So that's something that's really common, again, in children and older adults. It also can be sexual abuse, right? Incest, sexualizing children's behavior, sexual touching or kissing. We saw a lot of this with Brittany growing up. She was hypersexualized as a young adult before she became 18. So there's also some ACEs potentially going on with Britney Spears. For emotional abuse, again, remember how I said the wheel exists? There's that, and then there's these dynamics of being a child, right? So in emotional abuse, there's also isolation from family or peers, name calling, shaming, being inconsistent around messaging, or using the child to give or get information on the non-offending parent. This can also look like threats, threats to abandon the child, to commit homicide or suicide, to confine them, right? To send them away into juvie, right? You're going to go to juvie if you're a bad kid, or harm their loved ones, or to not see the non-offending parent anymore. They can also utilize intimidation. So instilling fear, right? Through looks, actions, and gestures. They can be violent towards the other parent or pets, use institutions as punishment. They can also use, things like God, police, psych wards, foster homes, school, those things as punishment, right? Threats of all of those things. And then they can also use their adult privilege, using their physical size over the child, treating the child as a servant, excessive punishment, or denying input in custody or visitation, interrupting, right? Not asking them where they feel safe, what feels the best for them, not including them in the process. So it's really important that we understand that these also, again, exist in tandem with when we're talking about children, because they are experiencing it both as a witness, as a tactic, and then their own internal experience as well. So then what that brings us to is older adults, right? So when we're talking about family violence, it's important we talk about older adults, not only because, right, they're humans and have agency and we serve all survivors, but because the way that the nuclear family is no longer a thing. We see a lot of grandparents as caregivers now, primary caregivers for an array of reasons, right? Specifically around substance use and the opioid crisis. So we see a lot of intimate partner violence in later life. So just as they can step in the role of caregiver, they're also experiencing intimate partner violence. And what that is any physical, sexual, financial, and emotional abuse of an older person who's 60 years and older. And again, the way that we do it is in a trauma-informed, survivor-centered way. So this differs from the term elder abuse because it doesn't include things like neglect, or it's not committed by strangers or caregivers who don't have that intimate relationship, right? So again, a family member, a current or former spouse, those are what we're talking about. And when we're talking about IPV and family violence, we're talking about a family member. So this is where what Lauren asked about a child implementing violence against a parent can come in, or an older, someone that's younger onto an older sibling. The reason this can happen is because there's a perception of less agency and a lot of ageism that exists around older adults and how they exist in the world. They're also at a greater vulnerability because they're more likely to engage in systems. They have a higher potential for injury, and a lot of assumption or actual cognitive issues, mental health and medications. And there's a lot of barriers for reporting their experiences, right? So whenever we think about sexual violence in older adults, no one wants to think about that. Like, old people don't have sex. That is not true. They may be asexual, and that's a valid, identity. But again, older adults have agency. They're living their lives similar to the rest of us. So they're also able to experience violence in their relationships. So the way that this can show up are a lot. And oftentimes when we hear about the perpetrators of IPV, the abusers, they make comments like, they're just too difficult to care for. I don't know what else to do. Or they abused me as a child, right? And like, they can handle it, and they can minimize that abuse by stating that person bruises easily, right? Or this was, oh, they only have that bruise on the back of their arm because I was moving them while providing care. When in reality, you wouldn't grab someone here to help lift them. It's from a physical grab, right? So again, when we talk about how this can present, it can be, again, physical abuse. So the hitting, pinching, breaking bones, the orange, forcing the older adult to take medications against their will. And this isn't, hey, it's time for meds. It's isolate and medicate, right? To get them incoherent to then be able to do things to the older adult or act on their behalf without their consent because they're not present. They can also create hazards or block access to doorways in order to control their range of motion. Psychological abuse occurs in older adults. And again, this is, those where they start to question their capabilities and reality, right? Of, gaslighting and telling them that, the abuse isn't really happening. You just can't remember. You're old, you don't remember, your brain isn't what it used to be, or scaring them into, you can't really take care of yourself. You need me here, or, oh, don't you want me to have this nice new thing that I bought with your money? Don't you love me? Like, don't you think I deserve this for caring for you or having to grow up with you as such a terrible parent, or whatever the X, Y, or Z example may be? Sexual abuse is the most underreported form of abuse with older adults for several reasons, things like shame, guilt, and fear. So sexual abuse of older adults includes, sexually touching or molesting the older adult while caregiving, or during toileting or bathing routines, or just in general, forcing the older adult survivor to perform sex acts or watch pornography or engage in sexual behavior without consent. They can also take unsolicited nudes, sexual photos, or videos of the older adult without consent. There is a huge market for dementia porn that exists. That is a very real thing. And that's where we see mental health coercion coming into sexual abuse, which can go into financial abuse, which can also all bleed into human trafficking of older adults, which is also a conversation that we have at the coalition. They can also, again, deny access to walkers, chairs, glasses, hearing aids, dentures, other assistive devices. They can capitalize on fears of police brutality and racial bias, right? If you call the cops, they're not going to listen to me. They're not going to listen to you. You know what's going to happen when the police show up here. They can pressure LGBTQ plus older adults to come out or force them to go back in order to receive care, or be denied basic things like food, heat, care, medications, tea, or hormones. They cannot follow medical recommendations or refuse to dress or dress inappropriately, either for the weather or their gender expression, or threaten to place them into an institution, right? Because everyone wants to age safely at home, and the abuser wants to deny that. Again, we see a lot of isolation that's really prominent with older adults to begin with, but then when abuse is occurring, it makes it even more so. And then, of course, when we talk about financial abuse, again, that's the most prominent form of abuse. But when we talk about older adults, again, that's like another major thing that goes on, because this is where we see the exploitation or the mismanagement or misuse of money, property, or assets, and then that abuse or exploitation of power of attorney or guardianship, which includes, withholding benefits, stealing them, putting them in living facilities, liquidate, isolate, medicate, which can lead into legalized racketeering, and again, benefits trafficking. So again, we see a lot of this. So how this shows up is, lack of social connections and support, unexplained bruising or broken bones, lack of basic hygiene, no or limited access to adequate food or clothing, unexplained weight loss, unexplained lack of funds, missing medications, seemingly over or under medicated, suddenly pulled from enjoyable activities, or missing or broken medical equipment. So again, as I said before, advocates in Pennsylvania are not mandated reporters of elder abuse. But if you do suspect, again, these are the two hotline numbers that are really great. We have the National Human Trafficking Hotline that you can even text to get information, as well as the Protective Services Hotline. And then again, for anyone that you suspect, or if you yourself are finding some of the tactics that we talked about today, something that you are experiencing or have questions about it, we do have our Find Your Local DV program. You enter in the zip code and it'll pull up all the programs near you, and it goes in order of close to far away. Again, all of our programs serve anybody who's had experience with domestic violence, including family violence, right? Because that's why we're here. When we talk about domestic violence, it's not just intimate partners, it's also family. So any survivor of domestic violence qualifies for our services. It doesn't have to be something immediate. It could be something from years ago, right? As long as you had this experience, we're here to provide support. We have an array of services depending on what county you're in. So please utilize that tool and reach out with any questions. And with that, I'm going to end my PowerPoint, but ask Lauren if there's any additional questions.
Jessa, that was so incredible. Thank you for all of that great and in-depth information. And I know that there was a lot of information put out there. So just to remind folks, this video will be here on Facebook, and we'll also post this when we're done on YouTube. If you'd ever like to refer back to it, to go back over some of that information, or to view the wheel that Jessa shared with us as well. So I am not seeing any further questions. So in that case, I think we can wrap up for today. And Jessa, thank you again so much for talking with us about family violence. As you and I both mentioned, it's really important for people to understand that that is part of domestic violence, that it's not just intimate partners. It can be any familiar relationship that uses these power and control tactics against somebody else in their household and their family. So thank you, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.